Hi. So I'm Howard, and I work at MetLife, and I run customer experience and design, which means I'm responsible for thinking about the end-to-end customer experience for this large global company. But I actually come from startups. I started a software company when I was younger. I've been in tech roles. I've been an engineer. I went from there and I worked at a couple of agencies. I worked at Ogilvy, and then I ran a design program and a brand program at IBM, and now I'm at MetLife. And part of my role at MetLife is thinking about how all of the different pieces of the customer experience add up to the global brand relationship. And I want to talk for just a second about something that came up yesterday, which was this idea of, do startups need brand? It was an interesting thing on this panel yesterday. So I just want to kind of put a stick in the mud and say, I come from the school that says the brand is the sum of all of your interactions with a company. It's not just the logo, it's not just the design, it's not just the website, it's not an ad campaign. The brand is all of the relationships that you have with a company. So if you make a single product and that's all you put into the market, that's your brand. That's the brand relationship that you're giving to people. That's great. So to a certain degree, everyone here is investing in brand. The thing that's important is that just as you're thinking about your tech platforms or your product, and if you can think about how your tech platform or your product will scale, you should also be thinking about how your brand will scale. And if you think about the end-to-end relationship that you have with a customer across marketing, your product, servicing, sales, whatever it is, that's a system that can be designed. You have to design it. So if we talk about the experience economy, there's a very big gap between a company like MetLife that's 150 years old and a startup that's 5 years old. We have thousands of products. Some of the companies that we've bought, it's not out of it's not unheard of to think of us buying a company that was started in the 30s that maybe has handwritten policies. So digitizing that or creating personalized services around that is a very complex problem. So a lot of big businesses are facing this right now, this idea of how do you compete in the experience economy when what you have is this huge set of problems versus what a startup might have. So my team runs brand design, we run UX, we run digital marketing, and we've just relaunched the MetLife brand. We retired Snoopy after 30 years. I'm not here to pitch you our new brand, but I'm going to talk to you about the way that we've been approaching that work, because it's applicable to both small companies and large ones. I think an interesting place to start when you think about how to think about a creative system is think about Gothic architecture for a second. And Gothic architecture is something that developed over hundreds of years. There are a few individuals that are really responsible for creating the idea of what Gothic architecture is, but there's a cathedralness. If you think about Westminster Abbey, if you think about Notre Dame, if you think about other cathedrals, they feel like cathedrals, but yet they were built by different people, sometimes over different generations. And how did that happen? So there's not one master blueprint for a cathedral, there's not one master blueprint for Gothic architecture, but something hangs together. There's something that hangs together. And part of what that is design building blocks. Okay, so you might have a flying buttress, you might have vaulted ceilings, you may have stained glass or stone carvings, and then tradesmen would go from cathedral to cathedral and apply that, and they would even train their kids, and they would have apprentices, etc. So part of thinking about design at a very large scale is that we need to think about how to create those design principles to be reproducible. It's been really interesting going into Collision, and I've attended a bunch of the sessions at Full SDK and talked to a bunch of the startups here. Even if you're a very small company, you're going to be thinking about how your platform or your tech can scale. That makes a lot of sense. We need to start thinking about how design can scale and how creative can scale. And I don't just mean branding, I don't just mean the logo, but all of the things that add up to the creative systems that run that brand relationship. So there's this plot that I've been thinking a lot about, which is on one end of the spectrum, you have very creative environments. And if they're really not great, they'll be one-offs, right? The key to great creative is being able to scale it and reproduce it and do different things with it, but have it be truly creative. And at the other end of the spectrum, typically at large companies, you have very compliant systems. And you know, environments that are so stifled, you can't do anything creative because there's so many different contexts and people and technologies and policies that you have to work with. So how do you find that sweet spot where it's both a creative and very interesting idea and it's systemic? And I think there's a real opportunity here. So this is where I think about this idea of creative systems, right? It's something that enables creativity through, say, the use of those building blocks like I was talking about with Gothic architecture, but it works on top of things like your tech environment, your data strategy, your security policies. And as your company gets bigger, even if you're a startup, as your company gets bigger, as you start to think about how you move between being a small company with one product in one market to being a company with multiple products in multiple languages for multiple markets, it can get messy really quickly. And by the way, I've seen many startups get successful and suddenly the experience becomes very messy. So this is not a problem that's limited to big companies, but it is the problem that big companies are wrestling with right now. So there's three things that I think designers and brand people can learn from software developers. And by the way, if there's startup people here in the crowd, I think that there's actually some territories here that would make for some interesting products because I don't think that anyone's cracked this. I think there's an opportunity to actually build some products and some tool sets here. But there's three ideas: design patterns, continuous delivery, and open source governance. And anyone who's a developer here who works at a startup or is in tech will know what these things are. But largely these things aren't really understood within the design community. So let's talk about design patterns for a second. So anyone that's a software developer or that's in UX will understand the principle of reusable objects, right? So take a website, you have a login form, you need to take that login form and have a login form on another website. You don't want to create a whole new login form. You're going to create a pattern around it. You're going to create the UX. How do the form fields work? How do the buttons work? What's the design of it? Oh, no, by the way, what's the code base? Let's use the same code, both on the front end and the back end. That makes a lot of sense, but how do you apply that to design? How do you apply that idea of patterns to creativity so you can use building blocks to create creative systems? So this is just kind of a simple example of one of the things that we've done with this new MetLife creative system. We have this very simple idea of a flexible grid. Great, interesting, not uncommon, but you know, the grid is up there at the top. But if you marry that idea of a grid and overlapping panels with this idea of going into every market and creating photography that's linked to what our customers want, the value proposition for each of those markets, what products we're delivering, the emotional stories that we want to tell, the way we want to represent the brand. If you marry those two things together, suddenly you have this idea of a design pattern where it looks like the brand, but it's telling a very specific local story. There's a cathedralness about it. Not to say that this is like a cathedral, but there's a MetLifeness to it. That's what we're aiming for. We're trying to create a MetLifeness. And this is a problem that big companies have, is this idea of how do you make creative that's relevant in each market that can be very interesting and compelling, but that works systemically. It's very challenging, right? So this is just kind of one example of the way that we've pulled these thoughts together. The other thing is this idea of continuous delivery. It's very easy to think about how a design function should work at a large company. And I've been a part of a lot of conversations at some pretty big companies about how should the design organization be managed. You know, is it command and control? Is it more of a community? Do you have annual meetings? Are there reviews? Are there awards? How do you do it? But the fundamental principle that a lot of design organizations specifically at big companies, approach this problem with is to think about, they want to create standards, they want to have governance, and then yeah, they'll take some feedback. I think the modern approach to this is to think about what's happening in the development community around DevOps. DevOps is an approach. DevOps is this idea of continuous delivery, of being able to release code, not in big monolithic versions, but continuously. You've never gone onto Facebook and seen Facebook version 2.5 or Facebook 2017 January edition, because they're releasing code constantly, sometimes every minute. So what if creatives, what if designers were to be able to release in an intelligent way? If there's any designers in the crowd, how many of you seen file names with things like final versus .final 5, final 7? That's not intelligent delivery. That's not intelligent version control. And a lot of the times what you see when you think about design management is the senior designer is the one that is the authority on saying what the final version is. That's not intelligent management. So there's an opportunity here for brand designers and creative designers to use some of the tool sets that have been created in the software development community and some of those approaches for design management, whether you're doing UX or UI design or interaction design or pure brand design or managing assets. There's an untapped opportunity here. And actually, I think there's a platform in the making here. And the final thing is talking about open source governance. And when I started at MetLife a little over a year ago, and we started to talk about developing a new brand design, I talked to the chief creative officer of one of our agencies, really smart guy, but I told him that I saw the brand design at MetLife as an open source program. And he got kind of angry at me because he thought what I was saying was that it should be crowdsourced. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not talking about crowdsourced. I'm talking about open sourced, meaning we will reveal as much detail about how we're building things as you like. We will share the methods, we will share the approaches, we will train agencies, we will get you involved. And oh, by the way, there's a governing body that says, if you want to create a new addition to the creative system, whether it's brand design or photography, here's how to do it. Here, again, like software development, here are the methods, here are the tools, here are the patterns, and here's how you can create new elements and have it be considered to be part of this global standard, which is very different from just collecting feedback. It's very hard to get people into this mentality because what people want to do in creative is take brand guidelines and depending on your client, either use them or not use them, and then make creative and see whether it's approved or not. But what we want is we want our agency that's working for us in China to be able to look at the work, to look at the creative and say, you know what you're missing is a whole creative territory and set of design patterns around this, for this market. I'm making it up, in WeChat, et cetera, et cetera. So could they take that source code, that creative source code, and solve that problem and give it to us to become part of the global standard? So this is the kind of work that we're doing. So I'm going to wrap there, but the big thing that I would say is there's been this whole pattern with big companies becoming digital, which to startup people is baffling, especially as a digital native. That's a very baffling statement. But if you think about this transformation that large companies have around having to become digital, they will catch up with smaller companies in terms of being able to provide personalized services, delivery of information, and really will begin to compete in the experience economy in a tremendous way in the next 2 years. And design is the solution to that. And it's not just design, but it's an idea of creative systems. And creative systems are the future of how the experience economy comes to large businesses. So I'll wrap there. Thank you very much.